Greetings and welcome. My name is Jesse Nigro. I'm your host, and I happen to be the editor-in-chief of the North American Anglican online journal. And today I'm joined by a special guest, Mr. James Clark. I'll go ahead and introduce you, James. James Clark is a persistent advocate for traditional Anglicanism and Protestantism, with an appreciation and reverence for the teachings and principles of the early Christian church. He received his bachelor's in religion from Princeton University, his master's from the Divinity School at Yale, with a focus on philosophical theology and philosophy of religion. He's the book review editor right here at the North American Anglican, and his writing has appeared in American Reformer, Front Porch Republic, Evangelical Quarterly, Journal of Classical Theology, Cranmer Theological Journal, and I could go on, but I won't because I think our listeners are here to hear from you, James, and not about you. So, hey, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. And of course, the occasion for having you on is that you have a book, a new book out from the North American Anglican Press, and the title is "The Witness of Beauty and Other Essays." James, this book has been a long time in the coming, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. It did take some time to get it all together. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, good things are worth waiting for, I hear. And I've seen the book. I've read it. I was intimately involved in helping you to put it together, and I'm pretty excited to be able to share these ideas of yours with the world. And these ideas, as our audience can guess from the main title, "The Witness of Beauty," or the title of the main essay, have to do with beauty. Um, Now, why do our readers want to read a book or a collection of essays about beauty, James?
The short answer to that question is that it's an important part of Christian thought and the Christian theological heritage that has often been neglected or overlooked entirely in recent years. And more specifically, I think that a renewed attention to beauty in Christian thought will, or at least has the potential to, reinvigorate uh, Christian engagement with the world at large. And in the realm of apologetics in particular, not exclusively apologetics, but that is one of the ways in which I think uh, beauty could help Christians a lot these days in uh, how they relate to and engage with the world at large.
Yes. And speaking of apologetics, one of the other sources of truth or reality that Christian apologists are frequently relying on in the public square would be that of natural law. And James, you sort of take issue not with the natural law itself, but maybe the way it's been employed as sort of this rhetorical device. It seems that you think there are deficiencies in basically what natural law can prove. Is that about right?
That's right. So, for roughly 20 or 30 years now, at least, there has been you could call it a cottage industry almost of books published on natural law by Christian authors and scholars. And the way a lot of these authors talk about natural law is they talk about it as a way of engaging in the public square that doesn't require common religious commitments or shared religious beliefs. So essentially, it's treated as a common denominator of sorts that allows people of all religions or no religions at all to come to basic agreement about fundamental moral principles and political commitments and policies based on those fundamental moral commitments. The problem with that approach, at least the way I see it, is that in that same time period, in the past 20 or 30 years, the kind of consensus that these authors have suggested we ought to have been able to achieve just doesn't ever seem to have really materialized. And I don't think that's because nobody made the attempt to offer these sorts of natural law arguments that get discussed in these books. I'm far more inclined to suspect that the arguments were made and just didn't have much of an effect.
Right. Yeah. Boy, it's hard to deny what you're saying. I think a big example was the Obergefell decision. A lot of people sort of thought, well, we'll just appeal to nature about what the family is, and everyone will see it's just obviously true that our position is the right one. And it doesn't seem that that's been very effective. And there are probably a variety of reasons for that. But in your book, and especially in that title essay, you propose that beauty may play a role in this discourse that may sort of offset the balance, if that's representing your idea correctly.
That's right. So when I say that beauty could play a role in engaging in the public square, perhaps better than natural law has done up to this point, I have to explain that a little because it could sound like I'm suggesting to people that if we just show the people who disagree with us the right paintings or films or sculptures or anything else, they are somehow
Right.
magically going to agree with us on things. That is not what I'm saying. I suppose the way I looked at it when I was writing the essay on beauty is that at a really basic level, uh, before you can engage in politics or anything else in a Christian way, you obviously have to be a Christian first.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're starting with that basic step in how you're engaging with other people who are not Christians, then the task is not first, let's get our politics in order, but let's get our basic understanding of the world around us in order. And it's to that larger end that I believe beauty can play that sort of role in helping others see the world as we do.
Mm.
And without going on about it for too terribly long in the answer to this particular question, the reason I think beauty could at least potentially do that is that beauty is such a basic part of the world, or what I mean to say is that it's elemental to all of existence. Um, as as unbelievable as it may sound to many people who haven't thought about it much, there's literally beauty everywhere in all things, even in the things that on balance don't seem particularly beautiful. And the reason that's so is that uh, the way Christians see things, God made everything that way. God made
Right.
everything beautiful because he himself is beauty.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I think so. It sounds like what you're saying is in that sort of space or that role where many Christian apologists are employing natural law arguments um, in order to bridge the gap between a community of faith and those who lack it on some sort of basic moral human agreement. It sounds like you're saying that beauty may actually be the better fit. And I guess I can kind of see why, for the simple reason maybe that we're just trained to have our hackles up when we're talking about morals, you know,
Mhm.
right and wrong, do or don't do. I think that sort of what does C.S. Lewis call the watchful dragons? Are they become very much aware. Oh, someone's trying to push a different moral system past me. Whereas maybe with beauty, and not even necessarily as you said, it's not like there's a magic painting or a movie. Although I'd love to hear what some of your favorites are. Well, what might be good contenders for this role? So it's not like there's a magic, aesthetic experience that can convert the unbeliever necessarily, but it does seem to be an entry point towards this world or this worldview in which you can kind of entertain the idea of like, hey, we're in a God-ordered universe that is quite beautiful, that people might be a little more open to. Um, and maybe because there's less at stake. Uh,
I do hope beauty could do that. You mentioned that people tend to be more on their guard in the context of an argument, where they're trying to offer reasons and uh, rational statements to each other. So I think that's largely how many Christians have been trained to think up to this point. Uh, at least, again, I will say, let's say the past 2 or 3 decades, where you've had a sort of renaissance in Christian apologetic literature. Uh,
right.
any
Maybe ever
number,
since the new atheist sort of movement came out.
yes, yes. If
Yeah.
I had to name just one book in particular that I guess probably wasn't the beginning of it, but I'm certain influenced a great number of people, including me. It was Tim Keller's "The Reason for God: Belief in an
Mm,
Age of Skepticism."
yeah.
That book made a huge impact on me because it introduced to me this idea that it's possible to talk and think about Christianity in ways that are, you could say, intellectually oriented, or what I really mean by that is just thinking deeply about the reasons why we believe what we do and why it makes sense to believe as we do. Um, and I'm mentioning that to say that because of books like Tim Keller's book,
Hmm.
um, that sort of thinking has been reasonably common in the Christian world for a while now. But what I have come to think as time has gone on is that Christians are unnecessarily limiting themselves in how they engage with other people by thinking that, well, my two options here are to just do a basic gospel presentation,
Mm-hmm.
uh, read some verses from the Bible, or if I don't want to do just that or not do it at all in a particular conversation, then the only other thing I can do is trot out these arguments that I found in a book by William Lane Craig or
Right.
whoever else I happen to read, explaining why rationally speaking, it makes perfect sense to say that the universe could not uh, just have existed eternally or something like that, and that it had to
Right.
have a first cause, and we call that God.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that conversations like that can be helpful, and I've benefited from reading books like that. But the idea that that's the only way you can engage with non-Christians in a way that is intellectually grounded, I have just become very averse to that way of thinking.
Sure.
Um,
Well, I
and
couldn't agree more. I mean, just from my own personal experience, I got very excited about Christian apologetics when the Dawkins and the four horsemen of the new atheism were running rampant, and frankly, I was kind of newly returned to the faith and got really interested in metaphysics and all these arguments. And it didn't take me very long to realize that I had made myself a pretty impressive arguing machine, but none of my interlocutors had the training that I had dedicated myself to even understand how good my arguments, quote unquote, were. Right? They just, I remember a pretty smart guy, and I said, well, you're just saying that because of your presupposed worldview of materialism. And he offended said, how dare you assume that because I'm an atheist that I'm really into money and material objects? I'm like, no, that's not what I meant. I guess I used a big word there. But that just happens more and more. I think, yeah, it's not like fideism and rationalism are the only options. And I like how you said it's not that an appeal to beauty is abandoning sort of a rational basis or sort of foundation, but it also maybe doesn't have to assume that your interlocutor has been hitting the books and knows their metaphysics and whatnot as well, which to me seems like an advantage for the normal Joe out there.
yeah, and I want to make another point here, based on something you said earlier, which was about uh, acquainting people with the way Christians see the world or the Christian worldview, and doing that through works of beauty or just beauty in general. So I'm going to get into the weeds just a tiny bit on this topic because, believe it or not, other people have talked about beauty before in the context of Christian apologetics. And there have already been a number of books exploring that possibility. And what I noticed when I was reading them is that they talk a lot about the power of beauty and imagination as a way of, again, engaging with other people and perhaps getting them to think more about other ways of looking at the world, and more specifically, the Christian way of looking at the world. And what became clear as I was reading a number of these books is that essentially what beauty amounted to was a stepping stone on the way ultimately back to rational discourse and argumentation. Um, kind of kind of sneaky, bring bring Christian engagement as, or bring rational discourse as Christian engagement back in through the back door sort of way. So the idea on this view is that, okay, so we can read books, we can watch films, we can experience art, and as we're doing those things, these works of art can serve as a sort of jumping off point for the rational discussion that we are now going to have about uh, what's true and what isn't, and is God real, and so on and so forth. And basically, I didn't really think much of that either as the ultimate terminus for how we think about beauty or integrate it into how we engage with people. Um, because it's very easy to think of it that way, because again, we're so used to being oriented around uh, rational argumentation and discourse as the only possible foundation for a solidly rooted belief in Christianity.
Hmm.
Um, what I want to try to convey to people is that uh, experiences of beauty can be, or I would hope them to be, even more basic in nature than that. So when I say I hope that beauty can play this role for non-Christians, I mean something even more fundamental than just we're going to use this as a way to start having start having that rational dialogue conversation. I mean something as basic and simple as uh, God is in that moment you just experienced of beauty, in a way, not 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 in the fullness of how Christians would understand God as a triune being, Father, Son, and Spirit, not fully as he is known or as we know him in the fullness of biblical revelation. But
Right.
God makes himself known in what is called natural revelation. And what I mean to be telling people is that beauty is a type of natural revelation, so that when we experience beauty, we are, in at least some sense, again, not the fullest sense possible, we're encountering God.
Hmm.
It can't get more direct than that. So, and that's
Well,
more direct than just segueing into an argument about God.
right, right. Well, let me play devil's advocate for just a moment here, James. Um, and before I do that, first, I think what I'm hearing is what sounds like a pretty legitimate critique of a form of apologetics that, like you said, uses aesthetics or maybe certain cultural items, movies or whatnot, as a jumping off, sort of like the youth group model. Like, all right, we watched this scene from Braveheart. Now let's talk about the truly brave person, and that was Jesus or something. And maybe it's more sophisticated than that, but um, always sort of uh, maybe neglecting the real power of beauty for sort of in and of itself, and always sort of instrumentalizing it for this more to get you to that dialectical engagement. So I can see that as a legitimate critique. But what if I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, well, could this emphasis be used to sort of present Christianity sans dogmatic content, sort of as the aesthetic alone? Because certainly, if you look at American religion, we could say that a lot of the prettiest churches with the best liturgies and the most beautiful ceremony and whatnot also have the most liberal and you could say least Christian theology and beliefs. So, um, what would you say to that concern?
There's no question that if beauty is cut off or separated from truth and goodness, which three form that traditional triad, beauty, goodness, and truth, bad things will happen. Um, and
Right.
I definitely don't support or agree with the idea that we can or should elevate beauty at the expense of doctrinal truth or rigor
Mm-hmm.
or moral truth or rigor. What I mean to what I mean to suggest is that uh, beauty. I may have spoken a bit strongly before in my criticism of uh, instrumentalizing beauty as just a stepping stone to rational discussion. Uh, if I may mitigate what I said just a bit,
Feel
it is
free.
not. It's not that I'm saying that those uh, conversations afterwards shouldn't ever happen.
Right.
Let me be concrete. I don't think for a second that you can grant to someone an experience of beauty and that that's all they need to uh, come to Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
to become a Christian. That couldn't be the case because
Right.
a large part of what it means to become a Christian is having at least some basic understanding of the gospel. You need to use words to, well, you probably should use words to explain what the gospel is. So I'm not saying none of that is necessary.
Right.
What I mean to say is that uh, at a very basic level, it's important to distinguish between supernatural knowledge of God or supernatural revelation versus natural revelation.
Right.
And I'm talking about beauty as a means of natural revelation.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
what you can go ahead.
well, I think, I think I agree with you. It seems to me that, uh, even though there probably are people who would advocate for a sort of beauty, a faith based around sort of aesthetic sans the dogmas that they find particularly prickly. Because sometimes, I mean, let's face it, some of the most important Christian content is actually ugly, right? Like a crucified man, right? Um, so it can't become like the one thing that judges all the others. But to your point about natural law, we also don't think that we can just leave people at being thoroughly moral people, right? That doesn't get you to Jesus necessarily either. So, um, as a different mode of natural revelation, I think your proposal of beauty is an intriguing one. And it makes me think that maybe these different transcendentals um, can and should be applied or appealed to, um, depending on sort of just what the world looks like outside your front door. A lot's been made about the fact that we now live in the negative world, to use Aaron Rind's schema, um, which might mean that right now, um, in the year of our Lord, uh, in the United States, in the West, and wherever we're at, people are just going to be less receptive of the moral truths than they might be to appeals to transcendent beauty. And maybe that would change in 5 or 10 years. What would you say to that?
I do think that we dare not uh, drop any of these three in our way of dealing with the world: beauty, goodness, and truth. They go together because in the traditional small c Catholic understanding of beauty, goodness, and truth, they're different facets of the same reality. So trying to separate them from one another doesn't even make sense. Now, having said that, I am focusing on beauty in particular precisely because I don't think many Christians these days need to be told to stand up for truth or goodness. I think they've been
Hmm.
trying to do that as well as they can for a while now. But somehow along the way, seems like beauty got left out a lot of the time. Uh,
Yeah,
and it's just been thought of as this, well, I'd say it's often not been thought of at all, but when it is thought of, it's somehow treated as this purely subjective phenomenon that doesn't have anything in the way of uh, objectivity or universality to it.
right.
And I would like to suggest to people that that's a or that's a strange attitude to hold. If you think truth, if you think truth stands, if you think the same truth stands around the world, if you think the same goodness stands around the world, why did you leave beauty out? If they really go together, and they do.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think there are reasons why beauty is neglected, uh, both at large in society and in Christian communities. And maybe you'd agree with me here that that critique probably lands harder on some Christian communities than others. Um, I mean, look, I introduced you as a persistent advocate of traditional Anglicanism. Is there something about sort of the ethos of Anglicanism or a traditional Christian outlook that is a better facilitator or that values beauty more highly than maybe other Christian traditions? I mean, certainly if you look out your front door, I mean, I think Roger Scruton was great on this, just the idea that brutalist architecture has this kind of uh, oppressive effect on people, that the what he called a cult of ugliness seems to pervade in many ways. Um, so I guess, yeah, my question is twofold: is do you think some Christians are valuing beauty better than others, and how should we be doing that? And second of all, uh, w- what do we have to offer the non-believers? And, is there a way to get the church back as sort of the leader of defining what beauty is?
I'm going to try to avoid giving an overly technical answer to the first question as to if there are certain groups of Christians that are better at uh, focusing on or incorporating beauty in their life than others.
Yeah.
Um,
Or maybe what should we be aspiring to,
okay,
regardless of what group we find ourselves in?
okay. Well, I think I think there's a popular sense that in a lot of cases, uh, Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox are more popularly associated with valuing the aesthetic in both their worship and perhaps just their larger approach to Christian engagement with the world. And I think the reason for that is probably just that a lot of the time they are more connected with, I suppose, older or more traditional Christian thought. Let me be more specific. So, many of the ideas that I talk about pertaining to what specifically beauty is, what the nature of beauty is, draw very much from uh, a Thomistic approach to the subject, Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, in turn, drew on uh, Platonic and Aristotelian thought. And there is absolutely no reason that Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox or anyone else ought to have a monopoly on those ideas. But
Right.
it just happens to be the case that at least sometimes various groups of Protestants may be less inclined to be really acquainted with those older ideas or to accept them. Uh, Not again, there's, as far as I'm concerned, nothing preventing them from doing so. Uh, it just has to do with both being aware of those older ideas in traditional theology and philosophy and just being willing to accept them. Uh, One particular example of that is very much related to this older traditional conception of beauty is just the larger idea of metaphysical realism. Just this basic idea that the world around us is what it is, and our perception does not shape reality, or rather, we don't dictate what reality is just based on what we think we see or hear. Um, I suppose the best way I could illustrate it is with the saying that often gets used, or the question: if a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, does it
Mm.
make a sound? And this is supposed to be some really big stumper of a question, but the Christian answer is simply yes, it does, because uh, the phenomenon of the world is not contingent on our perception of it.
Right. Is that Schrodinger's tree in the forest? uh,
uh,
yeah. No, I appreciate your emphasis on metaphysical realism. I think that's uh, apt because where a lot of people are more than happy to say, yeah, of course, Christians can't affirm a sort of relativism with regards to goodness or morality, many of the same people haven't really thought through whether or not they're willing to affirm relativism with regard to beauty, or that aesthetic judgments are themselves perhaps objective in some sense. Is that maybe something you would say?
It's definitely a problem, I think, in a lot of cases. That was one of the most basic ideas or assumptions that I wanted to address in talking about beauty, is this idea that uh, that there isn't really there's no objectivity to beauty, and that it's just purely a matter of opinion. I don't. I could talk too long about what I had to say about that in the book, but there's just one thing in particular I want to mention pertaining to that, um, that I think will strike directly against that notion that uh, it's just purely a matter of opinion. So there's a scripture verse in Philippians 4:8, um, that I'm gonna pull it up real quickly here because I don't
Great.
have it in front of me right this moment. Those of you who are really deep in your Bibles will know it before I even get there. So this is Philippians 4:8, King James Version. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely,
Mm.
whatsoever things are of good report. If there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Now, I just read that verse because the implication in saying that we should dwell and think on whatever is lovely. Now, the word lovely is, I would argue, a rough synonym for whatever is beautiful.
Mm.
And if that seems like a bit too much of a stretch, I can now read to Merriam-Webster's definition of beauty, which I only just discovered today because I just looked it up. Actually sounds a lot like how Aquinas defines beauty. Aquinas said that beauty is uh, that which is pleasing when seen, or something close to that. And Merriam-Webster says that beauty is the quality or group of qualities in a person or thing that gives pleasure to the senses
Mm.
or the mind. Loveliness.
Yeah,
So all of
I
that
like
was
it.
that was a bit drawn out, but all of that was to say that um, Christians have good reason to think of beauty as something that's objective. And that was just one verse that I chose to talk about here. But my larger point is that despite the overwhelming popular perception that, as the truism goes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It is in the eye of the beholder, but that doesn't mean there's nothing objective about it at all, and that it's just purely a matter of opinion.
Right. Yeah. Boy, that's so good, and so many applications, I think, especially to church life, because boy, I've just always been someone who's a little bit, I don't know, sensitive to my aesthetical surroundings, if that makes sense. Um, if I find it very hard to like study or read in a place that I find viscerally ugly.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that, there's, if we're willing to accept this idea that our judgments about the beauty or lack thereof of a thing, whether it be a building, whether it be a song, whether it be the way people are dressing themselves, that those judgments sort of can be better or worse, then it seems like there's a huge application to maybe some people rethinking, well, how are we doing church, or how are we doing life? How are we doing our Christianity um, as a community of faith, but also as a community that is presumably interested in evangelizing the lost. If your policy is well, none of this matters, and what we do is ape whatever the secular world is doing, and dump Christian information into that vessel, whatever it looks like. I have some real concerns about the future of any community like that, especially if you turn on the radio today, because it's just not the same as I'm sure I know every generation says this, but it's not the same as what I grew up with. I mean, I saw a performance from some Irish uh, rap witch who put Marilyn Manson to shame with the satanic incantation she was up to just the other day, and thought, wowzers. So where do you draw the line? I guess explicit Satanism, most people are not going to bring that to the worship team meeting, but you know, I do know there's just about every brand of what the secular world is offering has been kind of turned into a part of the what Christianity has on offer, you know.
Yeah. The simplest way there is for Christians to witness to the world at large is to live a beautiful life. And what it means to live a beautiful life is informed by the scriptures and our tradition of Christian thought. And to say a bit more about that, uh, this comes back again to the intimate connections between beauty, goodness, and truth, and how they are different facets of the same reality. When I say Christians witness to the world by living a beautiful life, that's just another way of saying that Christians witness to the world by living a life of love and humility and self-sacrifice, uh, and one that shows the world of something greater or better than they thought was possible. And it is one particular element of that that I actually focus on in these times that we live in is the way Christians really can show something to the world they probably don't see a lot these days is by not being fearful or just
Hmm.
uh, very visibly just anxious and falling apart because that's what they see the world is doing, or so it seems, is
Right.
falling apart. It's
Yeah.
it's one of the it's probably one of the hardest passages in the Bible for Christians to abide by, but Christ says, "Do not worry." Now he's talking in particular about uh, basic material needs like food and clothing and shelter when he says that, but I think it's perfectly applicable to uh, larger concerns about people have about the direction they think the world is going in, um, and how so much of the time it just seems like everything's doomed or something like that. Um,
Yeah,
and and I don't mean to suggest that uh, Christians don't have to do anything or do what they can to work against uh, the evils we see in the world today. But uh, it's very easy to forget that how you're going about these things uh, can strike people just as much as what it is, in fact, that you're doing. Um, and
right,
this can be so complicated or can get tangled as far as talking about uh, how to conduct yourself in what you're doing when you're doing it. Uh, as it's written in Ecclesiastes, uh, to everything there is a season, and
right.
I'm bringing that up in this context. I'm bringing that up in this context because uh, sometimes we do have to present ourselves to the world in a way that could be seen as stern, less less warm, you might say. So I'm not saying that we have to. I'm not saying we have to give everyone the warm fuzzies all the time, or we've failed in manifesting beauty to the world. But at the
Yeah,
same time, being openly drowning in despair is it's not the witness of hope. I think that much is probably obvious.
amen. Yeah, I agree. I think, and to your point about having to sometimes appear stern, and talking about beauty, I mean, some of my favorite works of art or fiction are stories about how people do live sacrificially. I think, Tolkien comes to mind. You have heroism. It's not always fun and games. And yet there is, in fact, a call for this sort of hobbit-like life of actually enjoying the fruits of the earth and God's good gifts. So, yeah, I think the best kind of storytelling out there that is most meaningful to me really kind of models that really fleshed out human experience of, yes, there's suffering. Yes, there are things worth living for. Yes, there are things worth dying for. And yes, there's sorrow, but it's a joyful path all in all. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, even as a father, and we have friends and family, the way that we bear our own burdens and, choose to have our own dispositions in light of whether things seem to be going well on the global scale or not, certainly have an effect on the people who care about us and who are looking to us. Uh, yeah, very good points. Well, James, this has been great. I hope that our audience is as excited about reading your book as I am for them to get it in their hands. Any sort of final thoughts or ideas that you want to pass on before we call it a quit?
Well, I did want to respond to what you said just now about what beauty can look like today in the world we're living in. Um,
Hmm.
I've often found in my experience that so many of my favorite stories are the ones that are honest about human nature, the way people are. And I think that's really important in these times because so often uh, people are told lies about human nature, assuming human nature is even a concept in their minds. Uh, but what makes what makes the dark aspects of our reality pop out is that hope that's offered in such stark contrast. And that's what I've found to be the case in so many stories, really, or the ones that touched me most. And that would be a starting point, I think, for people to think about uh, what does it mean, or how could I uh, engage people around me uh, in a way that is mindful of beauty. Because, as I say, a lot of the time it's easy for people to just not be mindful of those darker realities. Or if they are mindful of them, that's where that's where they leave off thinking about it. The world's trash, and that's all it ever will be. But
Right.
if people can see at least that much, then show them the rest of it. Show them the rest of the
Yeah.
story that we're all living in. Uh, all all the stories that have ever been made are conceived against the backdrop of the ultimate story that we're living in right now. And those stories resonate with us insofar as they are attuned to the reality of the story that we're in. So that's something that I would hope people would think about uh, when they try to think concretely about, well, what does it mean to show people beauty or get them thinking about beauty? And that's the way I've thought about it, at least.
Hmm. Excellent. Very well put. Yeah, I think show them beauty, and you don't have to skimp on the truth while you're doing it. Um, Truth about our present realities, good or bad, or maybe truth about transcendent realities and sort of the big story. Yeah, that's good. Well, once again, thank you, James, for joining me today. The book is The Witness of Beauty and Other Essays. He's James Clark, and I hope you all get yourselves a copy and let us know what you think.